Good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen. I gotta do a different intro, Pete. I think I gotta. It's getting old. I gotta do a different intro. Speaking of someone who never gets old, my co-host, the man with the best hair in Gettysburg, the director of the Civil War Institute, Pete Carmichael. Pete, good to see you after 3 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. You know me well enough that I'd like to believe I'm a fairly easygoing guy. Absolutely. And I can take insults coming from any direction, but there is one thing that I am super sensitive about. And of course, I appreciate the fact that you played up to my insecurity, and that's my hair. And you can insult my family, you can insult my scholarship, but don't insult the hair. Right, Jen Murray? Look at her.
I agree. I agree with you, Pete.
Yep.
In fact, yeah, my friend Bobby Crick is a historian down at Richmond. He said, you spend way too much money to get your hair cut. And then he said, you then never comb it. Which is a good point.
It works.
It's out of laziness, I guess. So we are back on what, Jen, as you well know, would have been Civil War Institute Day here in Gettysburg. And I just want, again, to say how much I and others, including my daughters this morning, said that they missed rallying together with all these CWI attendees. These are people who come from all walks of life, but they are all united in a deep interest and passion for Civil War history. And best of all, man, they're just super nice people to be around. I can't stress that enough. I understand why some people would say, oh my God, if you go to the Civil War Institute as an attendee, you must be kind of like a diehard and you're into all the tactical minutia, and that's what the conference is going to be about. And I think that the two of you can attest that the conference actually speaks to a wide range of interest and issues. Mm-hmm. We've done it in the past. We will keep doing it. We will be back, I hope, this time next year. But it is particularly hard not to see all my old friends. And God, look kind of weather we would have been blessed with. Right? Oh, got perfect to go on the battlefield. And someone who's been such an important part of CWI has been Jen Murray. Jen has given talks, she's been on panels, and she's given a lot of really great battlefield tours. I saved her group once from Jen wanted to walk from the Kadori House and follow the route of the Iron Brigade all the way across, right, to Seminary Ridge, across Seminary Ridge, right, all the way into Herbst Woods or McPherson's Woods.
Yep.
She wanted
the last march of the Iron Brigade, Pete.
Yeah. But hell, you wanted to do it like on double time. You were going to wear everyone out. I knew I was going to lose people and get sued, but Jen didn't care. She was going to drive them into the ground like she was John Gibbon or something like that. We did not do that. We just stopped at the Kadori House. We also saw, which I enjoyed, was the inn, right, or tavern, where John Reynolds spent the night, which is next to an obnoxious fireworks store. But the wartime building is right there. Yep. So if you've not been on a Jen Murray tour, you are missing out. She is outstanding. I'm going to give a little more background about Jen and before I get the first question going here. So Jen Murray did her PhD under a fantastic historian, Ken No. We do a lot of show and tell, Jen. A lot of show and tell here. And this book, which I think is, I don't want to say underappreciated, but I think it deserves a lot more circulation. This is one of Ken's many books, Reluctant Rebels. It is an outstanding piece of scholarship, and it does a really good job of connecting his ideas to what other historians have written. It is a fine book. Ken, I believe, has a new book coming out on weather and the American Civil War. So Jen did her PhD there. She has taught at the University of Virginia at Wise, and now she is teaching at Oklahoma State University. Is that the Sooners? I can't remember.
Oh, Pete, I think you lost all your fans in Stillwater with that comment.
Not right in me, was it?
Get your Big 12 football correct. We are the Oklahoma State Cowboys.
Well, since I'm an Indiana Hoosier football fan, you can imagine that my knowledge outside the Big Ten is limited, and it takes all of my energy and all my patience to follow the Hoosiers, although they have turned things around. They're not Oklahoma State, even remotely close to that, but they're now watchable, which as an Indiana Hoosier fan, that is a good thing.
Yeah.
Now, one other important point here is Jen's excellent, important book, On a Great Battlefield, in which Jen Murray, and again, you can complicate my summary of your book, Jen, if you like, but it is a history of the evolution of the park from its very beginnings all the way, and really to the John Latcher administration. We were just with Scott Hartwig, who was talking about all the good deeds that Latcher did while he was superintendent here. This is a book for those of you who think that a battlefield park is a timeless entity. It is not. How parks change, not just in terms of interpretation, but in terms of the physical landscape, in terms of philosophies about historic preservation. It's all right here. It's an important book, a valuable book. I know we got a lot of Gettysburg fans out there, and you should get it. I think this book is signed by Jen as well. Another signed copy. All right.
Nice.
So, Jen, we have talked a lot, John and I, about the partnership between academics and public historians, and it's in large part because so many academics cut their teeth as young historians in the National Park Service. And I'm not saying that you're not a young historian anymore, but I will say this. You, in fact, worked here as a seasonal for many a year. So I would like for you to sort of reflect upon how did your work as a seasonal, right? How does it shape your approach to history as an academic, right? That's the first question, and I'll slip my second one in before I turn it over to John. The second one is, I'd like for you to talk to us about what it meant to be a woman historian in the Park Service as a seasonal, and then talk about what it means to be a woman working in, again, primarily in a field of military history where there's mostly men. So 2 questions. Fire away.
Pete, thank you for having me this morning and for making me a part of Civil War Institute. I always tell you it's my favorite event of the year, and I think that's certainly true. I received some emails from some of your CWI attendees, really bummed that CWI wasn't going on this year. So they're all sharing, missing that with us.
Yeah.
So you're right. I worked as a seasonal park ranger at Gettysburg for 9 summers. It started as an internship and then came back for 8 subsequent summers while I was working on my master's degree and my PhD. And I had a little bit of interest as the Civil War as an undergraduate, but not to the degree of making a career out of it. So the opportunity to stand on that landscape, to stand at Gettysburg, to be on the ground where 100,000+ Union and Confederate soldiers fought for 3 days and talk about that story with tens of thousands of people from all around the world was priceless. Public historians have a unique opportunity to engage with the public, and the American public and people all around the world have an insatiable appetite for Civil War history, right? They clamor to learn more about the American Civil War, and public historians, academics have a responsibility to help shape and guide that conversation. And particularly in these times now, these very tumultuous times, we have that responsibility to be at the forefront leading that conversation. And it's one that I think all of us embrace. We all welcome this opportunity because we're so uniquely positioned to talk about America's most decisive and important epic. And that's the American Civil War.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm somewhat envious of our students. I know Jen has a student from Oklahoma State that's at Fredericksburg. I have 5 students who are at Fredericksburg. I have students, most seasonal programs, intern programs have been canceled in the Park Service, but we still have some in Andersonville and also at Vicksburg. And for all those young people, boy, what a responsibility they have this summer. And the kinds of questions that they're going to have to field are so important. And so I am envious of them. And at the same time, God, I can't imagine being in their shoes at that age, knowing what I knew at that stage of my life. Whew, that's going to be some tough issues. But as you just pointed out, Jen, some really valuable conversations.
Yeah.
Out of them.
And they're well prepared. We've prepared them in the classroom. I'm confident we've prepared them well in the classroom, and they're well prepared to meet and embrace that challenge.
Yeah. It's always my hope that, that challenge will create, like you said, the word conversation is important here. I've always believed that the demonization of people for their historical beliefs, even, some things are beyond the pale. Let's be honest about that. But that's really a critical point, I think. No one wants to go on a tour and be told that what they hold true is completely false. You got to find a way to help people, like we all do, right? Be self-critical, be reflective, and good teachers, I think, and good interpreters can nudge people in that direction. So what does it mean to be a woman? And do you find, or have you found, that there is something unique in that experience, issues, challenges, or opportunities that you've confronted?
Well, to be frank, this is nothing I thought a lot of as a graduate student. And I think Ken No would kind of attest to my somewhat narrow window or aperture of that kind of perspective. But more recently, I've become aware of some of these challenges. I identify as a military historian with a Civil War specialty. So I attend SMH, I attend SCWH, and there aren't a lot of female military historians or female Civil War historians who do military history. We could probably name a few, but beyond that, we don't have a great extensive list of those kind of people. I think recently the COVID-19 crisis and these kind of Zoom conversations have highlighted the disparity of women's voices. When you look at different organizations having these Zoom conversations about the Civil War, and you see a screen of all white men, doesn't reflect the kind of diversity that they could, or the kind of different voices that they could bring into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And I'll say that, again, that's where there's a practical challenge, is to bring women into the conversation who do military history. So I'll talk about the conference, which I'll say, and again, feel free to disagree with me, but I think in terms of gender diversity, I think that for the most part, we're in a pretty good place, and I hope that will continue. But where it becomes challenging for me is to find women who are comfortable in giving battlefield tours for whatever reasons. They don't have a lot of experience doing it. And so there's a practical, like you pointed out, you do traditional military history. And when I say that, you do much more than that. And traditional military history it's kind of a thing almost in the past, but it is a practical challenge to find women to bring on panels in which it's just, questions that one asks about strategy and tactics. That's still a challenge.
Sure. And I think that's why you bring me back to CWI repeatedly. I've been coming to CWI since 2010 or 11, and
absolutely.
And usually do the battlefield tour. That's where I'm most comfortable. I love the opportunity to get out on the landscape and talk with people about the battlefield and explain to them what happened. But in doing so, those battle conversations or those tours become more of conversation than tactics.
Absolutely.
You can talk on the battlefield about tactics and strategies and blend the home front and the battlefront together. And so much of the recent scholarship of the new military history has done exactly that. Leslie Gordon's regimental history has brought those two battlefront and home fronts together. I
would even say that happened long before Leslie's.
For sure, yeah. I mean, that's
way before that.
Decades.
Way before that. Yeah, I would say, there are plenty of other women. Carrie Janey does battlefield tours a fair amount. Katie Shively at VCU as well. And so I don't want to overstate my point here. Ashley Lusky at CWI are the attendees who are watching. They have probably been on many of her tours. She did a fantastic tour of Iverson's brigade. Again, that all comes from her experience at Richmond National Park. So again, certainly we're headed in the right trajectory. And I agree with you, though, Jen. It is almost inexcusable that any conference related to the Civil War, whether it's academic or popular history, if they can't find women to put on these panels, I think that's a problem. And but I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic. All right, we want to turn to Jen's current project. So we usually talk about, and if there's more, I'll put it up there one more time.
There you go.
But today we're going to talk about Jen's current project, which just happens to be headed to UNC Press, to Civil War America when she finishes it. Jen told me she's going to be done with her manuscript by next summer. Is that correct? Is that what we're hoping for?
I'm hopeful it'll be done next summer. I had some research to do this summer, some things to tie up last minute sort of things, but of course all the archives are closed and research travel has become difficult for all of us, but I definitely want that on the shelves by 2023 for the 160th.
Well, sources be damned. Just keep writing, Jen. Just keep writing, huh?
Just make it up, right?
Just keep going. That's right.
Right.
Well, I'm going to turn over to John to get us started because we'd like to, again, obviously talk about me, talk about your research, and talk about some of your preliminary findings.
So, Jen, I have a very simple opening question.
Okay.
Why George Meade?
That's a question a lot of people ask, John, and it's a good, simple opening question. Meade has been, I wouldn't say neglected, somewhat neglected in the scholarship. The last comprehensive biography on George Meade is the Freeman Cleaves book called Meade at Gettysburg. It came out in the centennial. And it's really the definitive treatment on George Meade's life. So our field is in desperate need of a comprehensive biography of George Meade. And that's what my book will address. It's a life to death study of George Meade, focusing mostly, of course, on his Civil War career. And it's an operational study of Meade as a Civil War general. Now, to kind of tie that back, your question, John, to what Pete asked, I worked at Gettysburg, as I mentioned, for 9 summers and encountered a variety of people who had never heard of George Meade. They come to Gettysburg and they want to talk about Grant's victory in Pennsylvania. Some people, even a little more confused, were curious how Dwight David Eisenhower defeated the Confederate forces at Gettysburg. So the America's collective consciousness needs a conversation about George Meade, and I'm hopeful in a small way that my book will place George Meade in his rightful position as one of the Union generals significant in the Civil War and contributing to preservation of the Union. If my book inserts Meade in that conversation, I feel that I will have done justice to George Meade and made an important contribution in the historiography.
What did Cleaves have to say about Meade in terms of his interpretations? Does anything stand out, or is it a biography that is just basically a story?
It's a pretty good story. It's a shorter book. Cleaves has a overall fairly positive interpretation of George Meade, more positive, I think, than negative on the whole.
Right. Well,
there are some other people working on George Meade. John Selby's book came out a few years ago. John Selby teaches at Roanoke College, and he wrote Meade's command in the Army of the Potomac. So he looked at Meade from 63 to 65. I think Kent Masterson Brown has a book coming out with UNC Press, Pete, on George Meade.
Just during the Gettysburg campaign. In
the Gettysburg campaign. Chris Stowe knows more about George Meade than anyone on the planet who's been working on Meade quite extensively. Eric Wittenberg's working on Meade and the Gettysburg campaign too. So it's a way to say that George Meade is coming back into this popular conversation with all these works taking different approaches. I think it will give the justice to this neglected or misunderstood Civil War commander. So many canards and misinterpretations of George Meade need to be challenged to create a more nuanced interpretation of this important general. So
let's get to the canards in here in just a second. One other person to add to the list who's writing on George Gordon Meade is Doug Dowd. Doug Dowd does church with me and as a neighbor as well. Doug teaches up at Carlisle Barracks. So again, we have a lot of fresh scholarship awaiting us on the general. So get us started here, Jen. Tell us some of these misunderstandings, misperceptions of George Gordon Meade.
Well, if you follow any conversation on social media or you talk to people at CWI or Civil War conferences, they tend to distill Meade to some basic truisms or overstatements. And one of the quick ones that you'll get is Meade's temper, right? What is What is the nickname for George Meade? What is his moniker?
Snapping turtle.
Snapping turtle.
Yeah.
The old goggle-eyed snapping turtle.
Yeah.
Now, I'm looking at George Meade through the eyes of his soldiers. So I've spent a lot of time researching into soldiers' accounts, and I want to see how they understand him. And they have a lot of nicknames for George Meade. They have a lot of nicknames for him. They call him Old Four Eyes pretty commonly. But the old goggle-eyed snapping turtle is a post-Civil War nickname. It comes from Horace Porter's account. But that's wrapped up into Meade's perception as being irascible, right? Being volatile, temperamental. And I've found plenty of examples of Meade losing his temper on the battlefield. He does so at Fredericksburg, at Prospect Hill, when he wants reinforcements to take the Confederate assault. He gets excitable or irascible quickly. Fits of excitement is how I describe it in my chapter at Antietam. And he slaps a soldier with the broadside of his sword to move them into the fight at the cornfield. So you see these fits of excitement that describes Meade as temperamental. That's one of the canards. Some true, some overstated. Right. But is he any more irascible or prone to fits of excitement than any other officers leading their men into battle? That's the question that we need to ask, right? Instead of taking these truisms and canards, are they typical or atypical of Meade? Is he like Civil War generals on the whole, or is he more prone to fits of excitement? Right. Is he more of a martinet than other generals?
Right. Well, he certainly was, as you point out, known for his bad temper, right? And his impatience, and certainly others around him right of that. But you're correct, I suspect. Even R.E. Lee lost his temper from time to time. We never had really any sense of that until Edward Porter Alexander's Fighting for the Confederacy, which was edited by Gary Gallagher. I think that's, at least to my knowledge, examples of Meade losing his composure, which of course makes a hell of a lot of sense. So, I think you're right with Meade. With Meade, there's an overstatement.
Sure. Alonzo Cushing, commanding his artillery battery on July the 3rd at Gettysburg, doesn't he similarly threaten with a broadside of a sword to order his men to command the artillery battery? I mean, you see these same fits of temper from the officers to command their men to do things that we cannot understand. We cannot understand what it's like to hold that ground at the angle on July the 3rd or to attack Prospect Hill.
Yeah, certainly. Richard Ewell on May the 12th, when his line is broken at the Mule Shoe, he is swearing at his men and then using his sword as well to try to restore, but at least stopped them and said, you can't expect the men to form up and to calm themselves if you, in fact, lose your composure. What about the idea that George Gordon Meade was an apolitical general? Because I think the politics of the Army of the Potomac are so fascinating, so complex, and so important. And to help us understand, was Meade apolitical? And then could you sort of situate him within the Army of the Potomac?
That's a great question, Pete. That's a great question. And it's one that in beginning this project, I didn't expect to need to get into all the political machinations of the Army of the Potomac. But you cannot understand George Meade without situating him in that political discord. And the Army of the Potomac is the most politically volatile army in American history. Zach Fry's new book chronicles that discord quite well. Meade in 1860 votes for John Bell. All right, we know that he votes for John Bell, who your listeners will know this. He's the constitutional unionist. Right, so Meade is very much of that mindset. He's a West Pointer, so he's a conservative Democrat. And in the early years of the war, you see George Meade very much aligning with McClellan's philosophies of conciliation. Very much conciliation.
So what's that mean? Define that for our audience. What's a war conciliation look like?
So the key book to turn to there is Mark Grimsley's Hard Hand War. And conciliation is the belief that the majority of Southern civilians, white Southern civilians, are not secessionists. So the Union Army needs to act with kid gloves, which means leave civilians on the sidelines. So when the Union Army is in Virginia, it means not confiscating property, it means not looting, and it means not pillaging, to keep those civilians on the fence or thereby loyal to the Union. And George Meade does not in any way favor looting or these raids of confiscating Southern civilian property. He's in Northern Virginia in the winter of 1861 near Drainesville, and he's asked to go out. He's commanding a brigade in the Pennsylvania Reserves at this time, and he's asked to go out and do a reconnaissance near this farmstead, the Gunnell farm near Drainesville. And Meade takes his guys out there. Gunnell's a known secessionist, and some of his family members had been sniping at the Union soldiers in that area. Right. So he's to go out and do some reconnaissance, and his men get out there, and they start foraging, and they get like multiple dozen wagons of bounty. And Meade is outraged. He's outraged, and he writes to his wife, to Margaretta, later that week, and he said it is the most despicable act that he has seen yet conducted in the war, and he was embarrassed of his men. To be looting and confiscating property from Virginians, known secessionists, but that's what conciliation is. That means leave the civilians on the sideline. That's McClellan's philosophy. But emancipation and the trajectory of the war is going to change, and Meade has to change with it. But there's no doubt, and people like to talk about Meade and Grant, right? That's the conversation that will define the end of the war. But I find Meade's relationship with McClellan incredibly important.
Yeah.
Meade's relationship with McClellan. Meade writes a lot about McClellan. He thinks about war a lot. He looks at McClellan's conduct of the war. He looks at how McClellan navigates these complex waters of civil-military relations, and he ruminates on this. He thinks about this, and he thinks that McClellan's been railroaded because of political meddling. Now, that is not to say, to be clear, that is not to say that Meade is disunion, or other interpretations of Meade's views with McClellan that have been written by other Civil War scholars with a book published in 2013, is not to suggest that Meade is disloyal to the Union. That's a bridge too far.
So who's suggesting that he was disloyal?
Well, that's an interpretation of George Meade that comes out by Alan Gelzo in his 2013 book on Gettysburg.
And that disloyalty is based upon partisanship against democratic partisanship, and that's why. Right. And how does it manifest itself in any kind of disloyalty?
Well, it doesn't, but the perception is there. And that's what the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War is going to investigate. Right? The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War seeks to root out these pro-McClellan factions because they view them as disloyal. Right. And Meade finds himself wrapped up in that.
Would you say a victim of it of sorts, or he escapes it eventually? I mean, and you can maybe tell us a little bit about the committee. Well, let's just go ahead and do it now. And as you're telling us, I'm going to get a book to show folks, because the testimony of the committee has been transcribed and been published, edited by Hyde, H-Y-D-E. I'll get the title in just a moment. Could you tell us a little bit about the committee and about what Meade was subjected to, essentially?
Sure. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War originates out of the first Union defeats at Bull Run and Ball's Bluff. And the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War then is established in 1861, and its intention is to investigate these Union blunders. The intention is to investigate these Union defeats, and it will investigate multiple ones. Burnside's debacle at Fredericksburg will be investigated by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. Some of those members are in Fredericksburg just days after the Union defeated Fredericksburg, and George Meade will testify about the blunders at Fredericksburg. Some of the leading committee members are people like Zachariah Chandler, who Meade has a little bit of a history with when he's the senator of Michigan. Benjamin Wade, these are radical Republicans who are seeking to root out this pro-McClellan faction. So Meade has some experience with the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War already. He testifies, like I said, about Fredericksburg.
There it is.
There you are. But after the Battle of Gettysburg, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, in the winter of 1864, will investigate Meade's leadership at Gettysburg, the campaign, and even through the fight that fall, culminating in Mine Run. So Meade will testify to the committee several times. It's an interesting story, in fact, because the testimony of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War for the Gettysburg campaign is really spearheaded by some of the most controversial generals in the Union Army, Dan Sickles and Dan Butterfield. They had already testified to the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. Meade is in Washington, D.C. in early 1864 to discuss the reorganization of the Army. This is March of 1864, right? Because the Army is going to be reorganized. Grant is coming east. So Meade's in Washington. He's walking around the streets and he hears people talking about the investigation that's going on about his leadership. He didn't even know about it. He writes this letter back home to his wife and he says, all the courtrooms, all the bar rooms, all the conversations on the streets of Washington are about my leadership in the Gettysburg campaign. So he will end up testifying to the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. The book you showed up has a lot of those excerpts in them. It's a great book.
It is a great book.
About 15 generals will testify on the whole. And in the end, they're looking to see why Gettysburg was not more of a culminating victory, right? We can get into the pursuit. I hope we have a chance to get into that. They look at Meade's leadership. They question why he uses councils of war. So Meade's really on the defensive. Does Meade even want to fight at Gettysburg? He wants to retreat, right? That's the narrative that Sickles and others have already cast.
Just a quick question. I'll turn to John, and I hope it gets a quick answer. I think, Jen, you'd agree that even people who are well informed about the Civil War, even people who've made multiple trips to Gettysburg, they often are not aware of the Committee on the Conduct of War. And I think it's always wrong to sort of shame people for their ignorance of the past. I think that goes nowhere. And so I'm not trying to do that. But here's the question. It's aspects of the war, like the Committee on the Conduct, that keep people from understanding how divided the Northern war effort was, and more importantly, how partisan it was. I get weary of hearing we're more divided today than we've ever been. I don't know how one even measures that, but it seems to me that at the height of a civil war, you would have thought that partisan differences in the North could have somehow been put aside. But I want your take. When you think about the Committee on the Conduct of War, is it shameful? Was it unnecessary? Does it change, or should it change our perspective of Lincoln as a great unifier? I mean, man, he could have probably done, I mean, he couldn't have ended it. I don't think he could have exerted that kind of control. But how do you feel about the Committee on the Conduct of War and what it ultimately achieved or didn't achieve?
So I'll answer that in two ways. One, I'll answer it sort of relative to Meade. The Committee on the Conduct of the War, when they investigate the Gettysburg campaign, the committee doesn't do anything in the end, right? In the end, this is political grandstanding.
That's right.
They don't relieve Meade of command. He, of course, stays in command of the Army of the Potomac. But at the same time, Meade is up in Washington, D.C. with this political hullabaloo. There's a major campaign about to begin, and that's the Overland campaign. Grant is coming east, and when Meade should be thinking about the spring campaign, he's deeply involved in this political quagmire. But we can't overstate that, because the Civil War, in its very essence, is a democratic nation at war. It's a democratic nation at war. And Lincoln and the Northern people have to navigate that. And the two-party system might bring more volatility than a one-party system. And Meade thinks about that a lot. He looks at political generals and how they're appointed. He looks at the treatment of McClellan and thinks that he's been railroaded. Meade laments political meddling from the men he calls the ultras, the radical Republicans. He calls them ultras. And he thinks that they're meddling too much into the nature of the war.
Do you think they did? Meade right?
I think that Meade's sentiment is characteristic of professional soldiers who are adverse to political meddling.
Yeah, but I'm asking you, do you think Meade was right?
I think that McClellan's removal of command was the best thing for the Union war effort in the fall of 1862. Meade says, and I'll answer your question, Pete, because you can see I'm kind of avoiding it. That's why you're smirking. Meade says that when McClellan is removed, he says that no government has ever created a greater blunder. Meade was wrong. How's that for answering your question?
You still didn't answer your opinion about this. I mean, I have mine, but I'm going to hold them back. I think that we've been too easy in evaluating Lincoln as commander-in-chief. And like I said, he can't control the Committee on the Conduct of War, but he certainly allowed way too much partisanship. And I think that a lot of men died needlessly. I know what the argument in response is, that Lincoln's got to hold this democracy together. And to hold that democracy together, he's got to play the politics. And there is, again, I agree with that. But there certainly were excesses of partisanship that I think Lincoln was guilty of. And Scott Harwood just pointed out to us that, and I hope I don't botch this now, that the officers who were under arrest from Porter, Griffin, and Franklin, right? And thankfully, McClellan said, I really need these three men on the cusp of the campaign, and Stanton and Lincoln relented. But there was way too much meddling by Lincoln, particularly at the beginning of the war.
Well, you see that after the Fredericksburg campaign, John Newton travels to Washington, D.C. and meets with Lincoln, trying to get Burnside relieved of command. Now, Lincoln's upset at the insubordination, but he entertains John Newton. Then Burnside comes up and has to sort of recast his position. He offers his resignation, of course. But one of the first things that Grant does when he comes east in 1864 is nixes that. I don't need my subordinate officers moving to Lincoln to create all this turmoil in the Union high command.
Lincoln should have refused the meeting, and then he should have sent Burnside a note and said, yeah, your subordinate is being insubordinate. Take care of him, right?
Yep. Yeah, I find myself critical on Lincoln when it comes to Meade and the pursuit, and Lincoln's sort of expectations of what could be accomplished on that. But I agree with the political meddling.
Since you're there right now, just go with it, Jen. With the whole the pursuit. Give us the frame it for us a little bit and tell us what some scholars have said and then what you believe, if you don't mind.
We started talking about canards or misinterpretations. And aside from Meade being temperamental and a martinet, one of the repeated misinterpretations is that Meade did not pursue Lee after Gettysburg. He did not pursue, right? And between July 4th and July 14th, he moves the Army of the Potomac down to Falling Waters and gets to a culminating point where he could attack Robert E. Lee. And the whole conversation is cast as the retreat from Gettysburg. I'm going to call it the pursuit in my Meade book because that shifts the initiative to George Meade. And for 10 days, the Union Army launched a pursuit of a defeated but not destroyed, defeated but not crippled, not annihilated Confederate Army. I argue in my chapter on the pursuit and in some of the other work I've written, one of the LSU volumes on approaches to new military history, I argue that Meade's actions in the pursuit are successful in two ways, two kind of big framing questions. If you look at decisive battles in world military history, they're incredibly difficult to achieve. A battle that completely destroys the enemy, we can find a few comparisons with Napoleon, right? But more so, a decisive battlefield victory coupled with a successful pursuit that leads in crushing the belligerent, the enemy, is incredibly difficult and incredibly rare. So when Lincoln and the Northern public, the Philadelphia Inquirer, on July the 6th says Waterloo eclipsed, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. The expectations that they're putting on George Meade and the Army of the Potomac to be like Waterloo are monumental. So Meade's forces pursue. The Union Army has fought a extensive, tiring battle for 3 days. The soldiers' accounts during the pursuit are fascinating. The weather is horrific. They don't have shoes. Oliver Otis Howard writes that half of his corps does not have shoes. 15,000 or so Union horses and mules are dead during the campaign. The men are exhausted, but they get down to Williamsport along the Potomac River, and by July the 12th, they're in a position to attack Robert E. Lee before the waters of the Potomac River recede, and Meade can attack before Lee escapes. And on the 12th, Meade will hold a council of war, which is a whole other kind of fascinating topic of Meade's command. He holds a council of war on July the 12th. He solicits recommendations, advice, and actual votes from his subordinates of whether or not they should attack Lee with his back to the Potomac River. And his high command has changed significantly by July the 12th. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Corps all have new commanders, but the generals vote and they decide not to attack Lee. So on July the 13th, Meade will push a kind of a small reconnaissance. It's foggy and it's raining. A small reconnaissance that does not amount to anything. But Meade will telegram Halleck and say that, basically by the advice of my officers, we have decided not to attack. Halleck will telegram back and say, call no council of war. Councils of war never fight. Make your generals execute your orders. And then early on the morning on July the 14th, the Confederate forces have slipped across the Potomac River, and the Gettysburg campaign comes to a frustrated sigh instead of this big climactic moment. And Lincoln and Meade will have these series of, Halleck included, the series of telegrams back and forth. Some of your readers or CWI attendees have probably seen Lincoln's unsent letter, the letter that he writes to George Meade, where he says, your golden opportunity is gone, and I fear that you did not understand the magnitude. The war will be prolonged indefinitely. Because what did Lincoln expect? He expected a culminating battle on the banks of the Potomac River that destroyed Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces. And it didn't happen. But to say that George Meade and the Army of the Potomac did not pursue is an injustice to the Union soldiers. It's inaccurate because for 10 days they did pursue, but it did not lead to this big culminating battle that the Northern public so desperately wanted.
Frank Haskell of the 2nd Corps, in this incredible letter that he wrote after Gettysburg, it included the retreat. He wrote, we wanted to see Lee's men drown in the Army of the Potomac, and that I suspect that George Gordon Meade wanted to see the same thing happen, but it wasn't meant to be. Let's turn over to John if he has any questions, or we might have again questions coming in from our audience.
Yeah, I have 2 questions, but the first I'm going to bring in from the audience because when you go to Gettysburg, this is the other character that everyone talks about, and I think Jed's going to enjoy this. Do you believe that General Meade is partially culpable for the actions of Sickles? Did he allow a toxic relationship with Sickles to govern his supervision of Sickles' actions?
Hey, Larry, thank you for that question. You cannot talk about George Meade without talking about Dan Sickles. Even before Gettysburg, Meade sort of sees what Sickles is. He has his eye on Sickles as early as the winter of 1863. He sees Sickles and Hooker. Sickles is kind of a confidant of Joseph Hooker. And Meade writes that Sickles is a person of undue influences. He's a shrewd, cunning, bad influence. So he already kind of identifies Sickles as being problematic. But to your question more directly, Larry, regarding Sickles' forward movement on July the 2nd, I think it's hard to look at that any other way but to say that Sickles directly defied an order given by his commanding officer. Sickles is ordered to extend his line to connect with the left flank of the 2nd Corps, Hancock's Corps, down south Cemetery Ridge to Little Round Top. Meade expects him to do so. He sends his son down at one time to suggest or tell Sickles to hold that position. Sickles is anxious about it, as we know. He does not like that position, and ultimately will defy that order and move his 3rd Corps into an incredibly isolated and vulnerable position. And we know what happens when Longstreet's Confederates attack on July the 2nd. Sickles' 3rd Corps is steamrolled. The big picture of this is that it's really hard to disentangle George Meade's reputation without grasping Dan Sickles. Right? Sickles will have Lincoln's ear first and foremost, casting his version of the Gettysburg campaign, making himself out to be the hero, his 3rd Corps, and their actions to be the hero. And he starts to shape that conversation. March of 1864, he writes a letter to a New York newspaper. We've all seen the Historicus letter. We're all familiar with this. His testimony to the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. You cannot disentangle Meade's legacy with Dan Sickles. And Meade knew it. And so did other officers and soldiers in the Army of the Potomac. Charles Wainwright calls Dan Sickles and Dan Butterfield rascality and stupidity.
Jeez. Wow.
That is.
The other question, Jen, that I have before I turn it back over.
That's
I got
quote is Diary of Battle, which is the single best, I think, primary source from the Army of the Potomac. Charles Wainwright, Diary of Battle.
Yeah.
It is absolutely, it's fantastic.
Yeah. Jen, with the one thing that I think of has come to light over the last 25 years, especially with CWI conferences and us speaking, amongst ourselves as Civil War historians and such, is after Meade takes command and the Army moves further north in pursuit of Lee, the Pipe Creek Plan comes into play. And I know our great friend Steve Fann, the man who loves General John Reynolds. He often talks about Reynolds, and I often talk about the Pipe Creek Plan to say, did Reynolds know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people have never heard of the Pipe Creek Plan or don't know the issue with the Pipe Creek Plan. Could you go into how Meade formulated this idea and how he disseminated this to the rest of his Corps command?
That's a great question, John. And it's also one after the battle that is used by Meade maligners or Meade critics to argue that Meade did not want to fight at Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. But its actual use, the Pipe Creek Circular is written sometime late on June 30 or very early on July the 1st. It's in the official records, y'all. If you want to look at the Gettysburg ORs, it's in there. The Pipe Creek Circular simply is a contingency plan. Meade is given orders when he takes command in the Army of the Potomac to stay between the invading Confederate forces, which, don't forget, they're at the foothill of Harrisburg. They're at the Susquehanna River, and Washington, D.C. Meade knows very little about the position of any other corps except for the 5th Corps, which he came from. But the Pipe Creek Circular is a contingency plan. It's conditional that would allow the Army of the Potomac to fight a defensive battle at Pipe Creek. Pipe Creek is in Maryland, and it's about 8 miles from Westminster. And Westminster is important, of course, because it's the Union Army's supply base. So Meade writes the Pipe Creek Circular that provides for positions for each of his corps at Pipe Creek, should they need to fight a defensive battle there and lure the Army of Northern Virginia to fight them. If any of your visitors or your listeners are interested, you can visit Pipe Creek. Go south of Gettysburg, go down the Taneytown Road. There's just as you cross into Maryland, there's a pull off there, and they have some of those Civil War Maryland Interpretive Trail markers there. It would have been a great defensive position. The creek itself isn't important, but there's a ridge that runs, it's called Parr Ridge, P-A-R-R Ridge, that would have provided a good defensive position for the Army of Northern Virginia, should that condition need to be employed. Meade gets criticized for this because it suggested that he wants to fight defensively, but as soon as the battle begins on July the 1st, likely Steve Reynolds fan does not get the Pipe Creek Circular, but it's a conditional plan. And remember, Meade's an engineer. He's a topographical engineer. So he's looking at terrain. He's looking at places where he could fight a defensive battle if need be. That's what it is. But what it's made into be after the battle by Sickles and others is a interpretation that Meade did not want to fight there, that he wanted to fight defensively, if at Gettysburg at all, or in fact retreat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They also look at that in the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. Meade's defending the Pipe Creek Circular. It blemishes his leadership in the campaign. Sickles uses it to say that Meade didn't want to fight there.
Right.
John, do we have another question, or did you have one? Or if you don't, I have one.
Oh, go ahead. I'll look in our comment section while you're asking.
So let's talk about the Council of War.
Okay.
On July the 2nd. And again, I'm more interested in your interpretations. If you could just sort of briefly tell us, who's there. You don't have to go through the entire lineup. But how do you understand that? And again, if you want to compare that to how other people have interpreted, that would be fine as well.
I've gone into a rabbit hole of research on councils of war lately, and George Meade will have 3 of them in the Gettysburg campaign. The one we would know most famously is the one on July the 2nd at the Leicester House. He has one on July the 4th, and he has the one down at Falling Waters, which we talked about on the July the 12th on the Pursuit. Councils of war in of themselves are not unique. Right? They're used by George Washington in the American Revolution. They're used by other Civil War generals in the American Civil War. So they're not unique. It's a way to solicit information. It's a way to get your team all on the same page. What I think is unique and what my interpretation is in Meade's councils of war, Meade allows his generals to vote. To vote. So when they meet at the Leicester House on the night of July the 2nd, and they're discussing whether or not they want to remain in Gettysburg, and if so, how long, or if they should take the offensive, Dan Butterfield crafts 3 questions to guide that conversation. And then instead of just discussing it and gaining a consensus, those officers vote. They vote. John Gibbon votes first because he's the junior officer at the Council of War. And then after the vote on the 2nd, at least, that they decide to remain in Gettysburg and fight another day, Meade says, such then is the decision. So they stay, and we know what happens on July the 3rd. When they get down to the Council of War on July the 12th, Meade repeats that, and he allows his subordinate officers to vote. This is incredible.
Can we go back to the 2nd? Someone suggested to me recently that that the vote on July the 2nd, that Meade had really already made up his mind, and that it was just kind of just going through the motions. Do you agree with that? That Lee intended to stick, or Lee, excuse me, that Meade intended to stick it out? Is that
unequivocally, absolutely? Yeah, and you can see it. He telegrams Washington D.C. as much that he intends to stay and fight another day. Absolutely, he has already made up his mind. It is not, as some historians would argue, Meade wanting to use the Council of War as an excuse to withdraw from Gettysburg. There's no evidence that suggests that.
Good. Yeah. All right. So we move now to the next council on July the 4th, right?
Yeah, there's one on the 4th.
Where does that take place?
I think that's near the Leicester House also.
Yeah.
Not in, but I think it's sort of in that vicinity.
Right.
They're debating at that point on whether or not the Army of the Potomac should stay in its current position,
Right.
or if they should move to an offensive, and then what line they should take to pursue Lee.
Hmm.
And then the third council of war is going to be the one at Falling Waters, where Meade again solicits the invite and allows his officers to vote. He'll say in that telegram that he sends to Halleck, where they decide not to push the Confederate line when they're against the Potomac River, that 5 of his officers were unqualifiedly opposed to attacking. And Meade does not feel like he wants to risk an offensive coming off a victory at Gettysburg against the counsel of his subordinates. So as we talked about earlier, he stops, waits another day, and that buys time for the Army of Northern Virginia to move across the Potomac River. These 3 councils of war are going to be questioned in the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, his frequency in using them. Why do you solicit this kind of input from your subordinates? I think the bigger question is, why do you allow them to vote?
Yeah, that's a odd thing.
Why do you give William French a vote on July 12th?
Mhm.
Or James Wadsworth, who was representing the First Corps? 3 of those Corps commanders at Falling Waters had not been in Corps command, but for a week, and you allow them to vote. This is me saying this, and this is what I'm going to argue in my book, and this is the fun thing about history, because we can debate and have these different interpretations. Meade allows them to vote because it's buy-in. He's seen the command carousel of the Army of the Potomac. He's seen how volatile the command position of the Army of the Potomac is. That army's went through 3 commanders just in 1863 alone. So if he brings his subordinates in, what is he doing? Why allow them to vote? Why would he do that? Does it reflect responsibility or deflect responsibility? Or does it allow him to say, hey, these 6 generals didn't want to attack at the Potomac River, so I went with their counsel?
Well, there's nothing in Meade's career and in anything before or after that would ever suggest that he would hang out one of his subordinates to dry, right? He would never have done that, even after the vote, even if they had attacked along Falling Water and failed. He never would have gone public and said, well, these guys said it was going to work and I blame them. But one could say, well, Pete, you can't prove that. But I think there's something else missing here, and that is we focus so much on the vote, but what we're overlooking is the conversations that occurred beforehand, where Meade is learning about his army. He's hearing directly from his subordinates. He's hearing about their concerns about a range of issues. And, I'll make this point in a few hours to contrast that with, James Longstreet on the evening of July 2nd did what he almost never did that I can come up with any examples of, and that's to not go see Lee, right? His refusal on the night of July 2nd to go down to Lee's headquarters is inexplicable and inexcusable, right? Yeah. And that's not to say that, that Lee would have said, hey, well, what Lee always did, right? He got the opinions and then he did what he needed to do. So I think the focus on the vote overlooks a more important issue here, and that is Meade understood what was going on in his army because they just didn't go in there and vote. They talked, right? They talked.
Right. And that's particularly important on July the 2nd. He's meeting all his corps commanders for the first time. He's bringing them in all together for the first time. This is a command change that occurs on June 28th, on the eve of the largest battle of the American Civil War.
Well, I think it is shameful for anyone to suggest that conference was an attempt to either try to cover himself or to create scapegoats or that he was indecisive. I mean, you just put the context around there. That's where the armchair generalship, I think, goes. It's going too far. I mean, it is a pernicious, I think, attack on people's reputations, and we all, I think, need to be more careful when we make those kinds of claims, especially against someone like me.
Yeah, absolutely. Meade writes to some of his subordinates who were at the council at the Leicester House on July the 2nd, when this has become a point of contention. And he writes to them and says, did you recall during that meeting that I favored withdrawing? Do you recall that I said that I favored to retreat? They write back and they say unequivocally, no. Never did you articulate that you wanted to withdraw or not fight at Gettysburg into the third and final day. Mm-hmm. And nothing in Meade's pre-Gettysburg career, nothing. I know you said it was a snooze fest, but nothing indicates that George Meade is nothing but an offensive and aggressive commander. Nothing suggests that.
Well, that accusation against him by any historian is utterly baseless, and that's unfortunate.
Undoubtedly.
Unfortunate.
Jen, I have a couple questions from the audience I'd like to get to before we wrap up in a few minutes. I've, as you know, spent countless days and hours on the Gettysburg battlefield, and I often hear people, I run into people a lot who say, oh, I'm descended from Robert E. Lee or whomever be. Never heard anyone say they're descended from Meade. Are there living descendants of George Meade?
Yes, there are. In fact, I met one of them a few years ago. The short answer is yes. There are living descendants of George Meade. I would have to rack my brain a little bit more to do the genealogy of that, but the short answer is yes.
Michael Reinhardt, what was the most challenging thing about Meade's personality that you worked hard to portray in the upcoming work?
That's a great question. Meade's somewhat of an enigma. We started our conversation about him being temperamental and irascible, and he is that at times. But Meade is also an incredibly devoted husband. His letters to his wife are the kind of letters that any woman would want to receive. He's a great family man. He's a caring man. He likes to vacation at the beach with his family. He's incredibly scholarly. He speaks French. He takes the dignitaries around the camp of the Army of the Potomac. He's polished. He's diplomatic. None of those characteristics ever come up when we talk about George Meade.
Yeah. Now you said that, now I understand why my wife has always said, honey, your letters are like the letters of George Gordon Meade. Now I get it. I got it.
Yeah, he's a sweetheart to his wife. Very passionate in his letters to her.
His letters are fantastic.
Yeah,
they are. And you're not just to get on the personal stuff. Your point about falling waters. He's very clear in the fall of '63 that a victory of annihilation is just simply unachievable with Civil War armies. Now, I think there's a degree of passivity that he showed from time to time, even at Falling Waters, in which he did not seize that moment or that possibility. But overall, he realized something that I think a lot of Civil War generals struggled to fully grasp. And the letters, again, not just personal, but they attest to that too.
Oh, his wife is clearly a confidant. Like the Intimate Strategies book that Leslie Gordon did, the George Meade and Margaretta relationship, she's his most trusted confidant. And he writes about the war and about the politics and about his position to her endlessly. And she campaigns for him in Philadelphia. She works some of her own family political connections to make sure that he receives his promotion or his appointment to brigadier general and then to major general. This is a woman who's not on the sideline of his career. She is vital to the career and promotion in the image of George Meade. That's fascinating. And that's the way that we can connect the battlefront and the home front, because it is more than Meade isolated out here. There's so much going on that makes him the man and the general that he was.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Looking for more questions just in case. We have plenty to go. This one's an interesting question. It's from Lawrence again. He's coming up with some good ones today. The cheesehead that he is coming up with some good ones. Did Meade's participation in Hooker's Council of War at Chancellorsville influence how he conducted his Council of War at Gettysburg?
That's a good question too, Larry. And I mentioned the short answer is yes. And of course, you know that Meade and Hooker are going to part ways quite significantly because Meade continues to favor a renewal of the fight at Chancellorsville. That's why he thinks he's going to be arrested come the morning of June the 28th. And there's also letters about the Council of War at Chancellorsville written after to try to get the generals to say, do you remember what I said at Chancellorsville? Do you remember what I said? Do you remember exactly what happened there? And Meade replicates that on the Council of War on July the 2nd. He wants these recollections to be clear about what he said or did not say on July the 2nd. But participating in that with Hooker and then emulating those 3 times in the Gettysburg campaign, sure. And that's why understanding Meade's leadership beginning in August of 1861 is critical to understand how he commands the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army's principal instrument in war. He learns these things. He takes lessons from these moments and these leaders that he's served with for over 2 years. Absolutely.
Wow.
Jen, you have shared with us, I think, so many important insights into Meade, the man, as well as the general. And in all seriousness, was so looking forward to your finished product sooner rather than later. And eager to get you back to CWI, give a talk, a battlefield tour. Of course, I'll have to give my stamp of approval so that we don't have any fatalities. You hiking people all over the place.
You remember, this year we were supposed to be doing Bristow Station, Fredericksburg, and Chance of Spotsylvania was this year's tour.
Which was, I'll take responsibility for that. That was my design. I thought that was a creative way of looking at the evolution of fighting in the Army of the Potomac. And who was the person who sent me an email and said, I don't think I can do all that? You.
I said, I don't think we can cover all that ground in 8 hours. That's pretty ambitious.
Well,
but
slip a $50 to the bus driver and have him, accelerate, right? Just move.
Yeah.
I really want to get to Bristow Station. I'm embarrassed to say that I've not been to Bristow Station.
Yeah, it's a nice preserved area down in Virginia. Check it out.
Absolutely. Who's the fellow that oversees that? I should remember his name. He's a Shepherd grad. A nice guy. He's written about it, I believe. We need to get him to CWI and speak. But the point being, again, Jen, miss seeing you this year and having you part of the faculty. She's a big reason why I think so many people continue to come back, because she gives first-rate historian, but as you can tell, she's accessible, nice to talk to, engaging. It's a big part of the faculty that comes to CWI. I just want them to sort of be part of the audience and get to know people and to talk to them about their interest in the war. And Jen is absolutely superb at doing that. Well, Jen, I expect you to be on Facebook Live at 3 o'clock. You can do fact checking for us. You can send in the emails, right? Broomall got that wrong. John Heckman got that wrong. That Carmichael, man, he is on fire. I can
look at that hair in the wind blowing, that big luxurious mane blowing in the wind.
Yeah. If I could find a ball cap that could fit me, I would.
No, thank you, Jen, for coming on. It's been awesome, and I can't wait for the book because I'm a Pennsylvanian, so we got to stand up for our Pennsylvania generals.
Indeed. Thank you for having me, fellows. This was fun. Pete, always thanks for bringing me to CWI. And John, I'll be seeing you on a week or so now to talk about the Council of War again.
Yeah, we got 6 days from now, I think we'll be hanging out and doing a little presentation that will be upcoming for the National Park Service.
Yep.
So that'll be fun. So I'm looking forward to that. That'll be great. So thank you again, Jen, for being here and for your insights into Meade. And I can't wait for this book to be done. And I know you can't wait for the book to be done. So that's great. Pete, thank you again for being a part of this. I will see you in 2.5 hours. Remember, everyone, that we are going live at 3 o'clock to stop at 4 different stops about Pickett's Charge. And we're going to have some awesome presentations from Dr. James Broomall, Ranger Chris Gwynn, obviously Pete, and myself, because they needed a wild card and they got me. So we'll see how that goes. But thank you for all the questions, all the comments. You guys have been doing great with that. You always do. And we really appreciate that. And a lot of CWI attendees are in the comment section right now wishing that we were all together.
Yeah.
Obviously, we wish the same.
Yeah.
So please take care of yourselves, everyone. Tune in this afternoon. And thank you again, Jen, for being on. It's been awesome.
Yes, thank you guys. Have a good afternoon. Good luck with your tour.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you too. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.